Hello, I am Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on Sonnet 130, sometimes called My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, by William Shakespeare, an English poet, playwright, actor and theatre director. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and find it useful. Remember that you will never be examined on historical details or background information on a poet. However, if you understand the poet and their context, it makes understanding their poetry much, much easier. William Shakespeare was born in April 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. He was a poet, a playwright, and an actor, and is one of the best-known English authors. He wrote nearly 40 plays that included comedies such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, tragedies including the metric drama texts Hamlet and Othello, as well as King Lear and Macbeth, histories such as Richard III and Julius Caesar, and romances such as The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. He was even reputed to have acted in some of his plays, including Hamlet, where legend suggests that he played the role of the ghost of Hamlet's father. He founded 2 theatre groups, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men. When his theatre group lost access to their first performance space, which was just called the theatre, he and his fellow actors dismantled the old building, ferried it across the Thames piece by piece, and used the timbers to build a new theatre called the Globe Theatre on a marshy bit of land in Southwark in London. He was part owner of this new theatre, wrote most of the plays performed there, directed many of them, and may have even acted in some of them. The original Globe Theatre burned down in 1613 because a cannon that was used to stage his play Henry VIII misfired and set the thatched roof alight. Within hours, the theatre had been burnt to the ground. It was rebuilt and then demolished again in 1644. However, it was rebuilt for a third time in the same place in 1997 to the same design. And if you go to London today, you can watch Shakespeare's plays being performed there. He also wrote a book of 154 sonnets because they were literarily fashionable at the time, and they were also possibly a way of gaining favor with powerful people in the royal court. This book included Sonnet 130, My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, which we will be discussing today, and hopefully you will enjoy that discussion. During his life, Shakespeare wrote first for Queen Elizabeth I and then for King James I once Queen Elizabeth I had died. King James promoted him by giving him royal patronage, making his theatre company the official court performers, which is when Shakespeare changed the name of his theatre group to the King's Men. Writing was a very effective way to gain power in the Elizabethan court, particularly through the writing of sonnets, because sonnet writing was a way for a poet to highlight their wit, social connections, and education, particularly as the structure of a sonnet was so precise and was considered to be really difficult. If a poet wrote a clever sonnet or flattered the right person with a well-written sonnet, this could elevate their status in court and even attract the attention of the king or queen herself. Some poets went so far as to write sonnets that hinted as being love poems to the queen or other powerful political figures. They could only hint because an open declaration of love would have created an enormous scandal. This was a way of gaining favor and making powerful friends. You could see sonnets as being the social media platforms used by Elizabethan influencers of the time, even though they were writing over 400 years ago. Shakespeare must have been very good at politics, and he was clearly very good at writing, because he was the son of a mere middle-class glove maker, and was definitely not an aristocrat like most of the people at the royal court. Although he was very well educated in Latin, Greek, and the classics, the only record of his having been educated at all was his attendance at the Stratford Grammar School, and there's absolutely no evidence that he ever went to university. When he was 18, he married the much older Anne Hathaway, who was 26 and pregnant at the time. This was also highly unusual behavior for the time, because men generally married women that were much, much younger than them. And at 26, Anne Hathaway would have been considered heading for being an old lady. They had 3 children together, Susanna, and twins called Hamnet and Judith. Some scholars think that when Hamnet died at the age of 11, that tragedy led to Shakespeare's playwriting shifting focus to being a series of tragedies. Shakespeare's plays and poems have been translated into every major language in the world, and over the last 400 years, his plays have been performed more often than any other plays ever written in the history of humanity. Shakespeare died on the 23rd of April in 1616 in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. He was 52 years old at the time. Outbreaks of the plague between 1592 and 1593, and several times between 1603 and 1613, often forced theatre owners to close their theatres. When the Globe Theatre was closed and performers had nowhere to perform their plays, Shakespeare may have been encouraged to turn to the writing of poetry in order to survive. Shakespeare's book of 154 sonnets was written in the 1590s and probably circulated amongst friends and members of the royal court, but it was only published in 1609 by Thomas Thorpe, who possibly published it without Shakespeare's consent. Thomas Thorpe included a dedication to a Mr. W.H. This and the fact that sonnets 1 to 126 are addressed to a fair youth has led some scholars to think that Shakespeare may have been in love with a young man at court. However, it is also possible that, whoever Mr. W.H. was, Shakespeare might have felt the need to flatter him, and dedicating his book of sonnets to him was simply a political power play. Sonnets 127 to 154 are addressed to a dark lady and explore themes like lust, betrayal, and emotional contradictions. Petrarchan sonnets were very fashionable at the time, and they typically described unrealistic stereotypes of beautiful women in very exaggerated language, known as the language of courtly love. This language included very formal, cliched language. For example, I am forever the servant of love, and your beauty undoes me. Remember that cliches are words or phrases that have been so overused that they've lost their original impact. The language of courtly love and typical sonnets of the time also included huge exaggerations, which are known as hyperboles, and unrealistic, elaborate metaphors, which were called conceits. This is the kind of language that you still see in Valentine's Day cards today. For example, you have eyes like diamonds, or cherry lips, or where women are compared to the sun, moon, stars, or goddesses. The picture on the left shows some of these ridiculous language techniques. You know, we have a woman with eyes like the sun, and Shakespeare is written in the top right-hand picture, thy beauty hath undone me, and love fire consumes me whole, and there you have a man swooning from love. And I hope you can see that these are really ridiculous comparisons and ridiculous ways of describing real people. And Shakespeare clearly found this sort of language to be ridiculous, and he mocks and satirizes these techniques throughout Sonnet 130. The courtly love tradition and Petrarchan sonnets also involved idealizing a woman. To idealize something means to ignore or disguise all of its flaws. Shakespeare rejected this idealization process as pure lies, and he redefined love. He described authentic love for real, complex people in his sonnets, and he actually satirizes the really unrealistic beauty standards of his time. Remember that satire is an attack, the use of mocking humor on a political or social institution, and a beauty standard is a set of social norms or ideals that define what is and is not beautiful within a particular culture or time period. And you might be interested to know that beauty standards have varied wildly from one time period and culture to another. For example, the Elizabethans wouldn't have batted an eyelid if a woman had gone to dinner with a blouse that was so low cut that her nipples were showing. But if they had spotted her ankle, they would have just about fallen off their chair or crashed their carriage. So you can see that what is considered beautiful or sexually attractive varies from time to time. You will also know that unrealistic beauty standards still sometimes cause considerable harm and unhappiness for people who don't meet those standards. And in Sonnet 130, Shakespeare explores what it means to love a real woman in all of her complexity, all of her imperfection, and in her inability to meet those very traditional cliched beauty standards. To get you in the mood to appreciate Shakespeare's sonnet, I suggest that you stop this presentation when I've finished speaking and make some brief notes in response to this question. If someone was to write you a sonnet, which is after all a formal love poem, or if you were to write someone a sonnet, what would you like it to say? I've just included this picture to give you some inspiration. Jot down some notes, and when you're ready, continue to play the video. Hopefully you will see some links between your feelings and your feelings about Shakespeare's sonnet. Have a look at this cartoon and think about Shakespeare's motivations for writing Sonnet 130. This slide depicts a completely imaginary conversation between Shakespeare and his dark lady. Shall I write thee a sonnet? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Please don't. I don't want to be described as a beautiful but brainless object, and those Elizabethan beauty standards are oppressive and ridiculous. Write about me as I am. Obviously, there's no proof that Shakespeare ever had this conversation with his mistress. But as I read the poem, imagine how she might have felt to receive his sonnet. Consider how her feelings might have changed as she read. Also, please note that mistress was the Elizabethan word for any female romantic love interest. It did not necessarily mean a married woman who was having a romantic or adulterous relationship outside of her marriage, which are the connotations of the word today. Thou hast requested it, and I shall honour thy request. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. As I read the poem, think about the comments that Shakespeare is making about the language of courtly love, poetic conceits, Elizabethan beauty standards, and the nature of true love. Sonnet 130, My Mistress' Eyes, by William Shakespeare. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfume is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms that I use. I will remind you what terms mean when I use them, and I suggest that you write down any definitions that you did not already know. It is very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you cannot use the correct vocabulary. It is also a good idea to work with a copy of the poem in front of you, because then it is easier to take notes. Before I move on to the next slide, I suggest that you count the number of lines in the poem, count the number of syllables in each line, and use the ABC method to take note of the rhyme scheme. All of these aspects are important for the discussion of the poem's structure, which follows on the next slide. If you're wondering what a syllable is, remember that it is the smallest unit of sound that a word can be broken down into. For example, the first line, My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, consists mostly of single-syllable words, except for mistress and nothing, which both would have been pronounced with 2 syllables each, and I just exaggerated it there so that you could hear it. So that is mistress, 1, 2, and nothing, 1, 2 syllables. When you counted the syllables in each line in the poem, you would have noticed that every line has 10 syllables. Shakespeare has even gone so far as to contract damasked, which would normally have 3 syllables, damasked, to 2 syllables by leaving out the E at the end of the word, so that he could make sure that every line has 10 syllables. I've written a number of syllables in red in brackets after each line, and I've put in a red forward slash to show you where there is more than one syllable in a word. When writing contains 10 syllables per line, and it is read so that every second syllable is stressed, then it is written in iambic pentameter. You may know that pent means 5 in Latin. If you think about your study of shapes in geometry, a pentagon has 5 sides, and be wondering why it is called pentameter, which means 5, when there are 10 syllables in each line. Why isn't it called iambic decameter? Well, the reason is because the 5 refers to 5 pairs of syllables. Each pair is called an iamb and consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. This creates a rhythm that's a bit like a heartbeat, because if you feel your heartbeat, you will notice that you have a soft beat followed by a hard beat. So that iambic rhythm of da-dum, where you have 5 da-dums per line, creates a very regular rhythm, which emphasizes the thoughtful tone of the poem. If you are interested in the power of the iambic rhythm and want to know how it can be used to write rap music, I suggest that you search Akala, A-K-A-L-A, Shakespeare hip-hop video on the internet. Akala is a brilliant rap artist, and he really explains iambic rhythm very well. When you analyze the rhyme scheme, you would have seen that it divides the poem into 4 parts. First, there are 3 sets of 4 lines, or quatrains, from the Latin word quad, meaning 4, with a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then finally there is a set of 2 lines that rhyme, a rhyming couplet with a rhyme scheme of G, G. Each set of 4 lines, or each quatrain, focuses on a slightly different aspect of Shakespeare's mistress, creating a sort of problem statement in the first 12 lines. The final rhyming couplet offers a kind of a solution to the problem discussed in the first 12 lines. This is obviously a different sonnet structure to that of the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet structure that Wordsworth used in It Is a Beauteous Evening, Calm and Free, because you'll remember that a Petrarchan sonnet consists of 8 lines, an octave, followed by a volta, which is Italian for turn, where the poem changes, and then a sestet of 6 lines. And in case you don't know how to analyze a rhyme scheme, here's a quick reminder. You look at the last word of each line, starting with line 1. Line 1 ends in sun. Because it is the first line of the poem, it is given the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. Every other line that ends in a word that rhymes with sun is given an A as well. Have a look at line 3, which is done. Line 2 ends in red, which doesn't rhyme with sun in line 1, so it gets the next letter of the alphabet, which is B. The word red in line 2 rhymes with head in line 4, so they both get a B. And every time you get to a line that doesn't rhyme with the last words in any of the previous lines, it gets the next letter of the alphabet. Poems with a structure of 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet are known as English, Elizabethan, or Shakespearean sonnets, because Shakespeare was an English author who wrote during the Elizabethan period, when Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, and you can use those names interchangeably. Shakespeare originally used this structure in order to write his sonnets, and the change in theme and content actually comes between line 12, which is the end of the 3rd quatrain, and the start of line 13, which is the start of the final rhyming couplet, and that is known as the volta. So here the volta begins with and yet, and it tells you that Shakespeare is going to surprise you with a counter-argument. As you counted the lines in the poem, you would have also seen that the poem has 14 lines. So it has 14 lines, a regular rhythm structure, a regular rhyme structure. It's written in iambic pentameter. All of these things suggest this poem must be a sonnet. But sonnets are love poems, and this poem's insulting, especially for the first 12 lines. or is it? I do agree it's not a traditional love poem, and it's certainly not written like a card on Valentine's Day. But as we discuss the poem, consider the possibility that this is still a love poem, and it just has an unusual approach. Sonnet 130, My Mistress' Eyes by William Shakespeare. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. In this first quatrain, lines 1 to 4, Shakespeare seems to start off by writing an anti-love poem to his mistress, and he does this in order to subvert the language of courtly love. This quatrain lists the ways in which his so-called beloved fails to measure up to the Elizabethan beauty standards test. He starts by parodying or making a mocking copy of the traditional description of a beautiful woman's eyes, which are depicted in the middle picture so that you can see what a ridiculous idea it was. And he says that his mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun in line 1. That description of having eyes like the sun usually implied that a woman's eyes were particularly bright and shiny. In line 2, he says that her lips do not measure up to coral for redness. And of course, having lips as red as coral was another common and cliched comparison. Coral is a sea creature that builds hard, stone-like underwater structures, and there is a picture of red coral to the right of the poem. If you compare it to the lips of all the Elizabethan women portrayed, you can see that it's completely unrealistic to have lips that color. In lines 3 and 4, Shakespeare uses the subjunctive mood of the verb by starting the lines with if, which suggests a possibility. In other words, he says, snow might be white, in which case his mistress has dun breasts. That can be read as a rather insulting comparison, because dun was a word that was usually only used to describe the coats of animals that had a dull brown color, for example, horses and mice. In the final line, Shakespeare says that if hair can be wire, then his mistress has wire for hair. And in that simile, Shakespeare compares his mistress's hair to black wires, implying that her hair was coarse and difficult to control. The Elizabethan beauty standard was for women to have snow-white skin, bright shiny eyes, bright red lips, and fine, soft, golden or strawberry blonde hair, like the woman on the left. Notice how all of the imagery in this stanza focuses on visual imagery and colors which can be seen, and I think is highlighting the fact that women were judged so much on the basis of their appearance. Now, these fun facts that follow are not for examinations, but they might make it a little easier for you to understand some of the things that Shakespeare was satirizing, and the extraordinary lengths and pressure that Elizabethan women went to, and the pressure that they were under to achieve the beauty standards of the time. Queen Elizabeth led women's fashion at the time, as she was the most powerful woman in Europe. To make her skin look white, Queen Elizabeth I applied a layer of white lead mixed with vinegar to her skin every single day. It was sometimes applied in a layer up to an inch thick. The problem was that lead is poisonous and can cause symptoms like baldness, brain damage, and kidney failure. And kidney failure was one of the things that Queen Elizabeth probably died from. She also used a mixture of mercury sulfide and red ochre to brighten her lips. Mercury poisoning causes memory loss, irritability, and personality changes, not ideal characteristics in one of the world's most powerful leaders at the time. Finally, to get the bright-eyed look, some women would put drops of juice from the deadly nightshade or belladonna plant in their eyes. Excuse me. Belladonna is Italian for beautiful woman, and the name comes from the fact that belladonna juice causes the pupils of the eyes to dilate and become enormous. For some reason, Elizabethan men seemed to think that large pupils were a mark of intelligence, passion, and were wildly attractive. The side effects were unpleasant. blurred vision, and in the long term, potential blindness, and if used in large enough quantities, insanity. Talk about paying a high price for beauty. It seems that, in the long term, Elizabethan men must have actually enjoyed their women being bald, blind, and crazy. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in some perfume is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. In the second quatrain, lines 5 to 8, Shakespeare ridicules yet another courtly love conceit or metaphor that was often used in sonnets, and that you might still hear in conversation today. That was saying that someone had roses in their cheeks to highlight the fact that they had this pure white skin with pink cheeks. He says that he has seen damasked roses, which is a rose with petals of mixed colors, like the one in the picture on the right. Damasked fabric had a pattern of contrasting color as well that stood out against a background color, and you can see some damasked fabric in that picture on the right. According to Shakespeare, he knows what damasking looks like in roses or fabric, but when he looks at his mistress's cheeks, he can't see any roses. Of course, roses are also associated with a beautiful scent, and this stanza focuses on imagery that describes smells, olfactory sensory imagery. In lines 7 to 8, Shakespeare really seems to ramp up on the insults, saying that some perfumes smell far better, there is more delight or pleasure to be had from them than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. Today, the word reeks has entirely negative connotations, and it means something similar to stinks or hones. However, the Elizabethans used the word reeks in archaic English, English that is no longer used in quite the same way. And in Elizabethan English, reeks could mean both pleasant or unpleasant smells. It just meant a vapor with a strong smell. However, it is unlikely that any of the Elizabethans had particularly pleasant breath, especially if they were wealthy. So here's another fun non-exam fact. During the Elizabethan era, sugar was a luxury item that was only available because it could be imported for thousands of kilometers from the colonies. Therefore, only the rich could afford it, and Elizabeth I, like so many nobles of her time, indulged heavily in sugary treats. She even used a sugar-based toothpaste because sugar is abrasive and could scrape the teeth. Unfortunately, it also chews holes in your enamel, which she didn't know. This only worsened the damage to her teeth, and ironically, black teeth became a status symbol. Because only the wealthy could afford sugar and the dental ruin it caused, some people even artificially blackened their teeth so that they could mimic the elite. You can see Shakespeare's mistress laughing in the picture on the bottom left, possibly with artificially blackened teeth, but she seems to me to be the kind of woman who probably wouldn't have been embarrassed by blackened teeth and would have had a good laugh. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. In this third quatrain, lines 9 to 12, Shakespeare seems to continue with his negative comparisons, in which he constantly highlights what his mistress is not and how she doesn't measure up to Elizabethan beauty standards. But in lines 9 and 10, his tone does seem to start to shift and become a little more admiring of his mistress. He says he loves to hear her speak, even though music sounds a lot better than her voice, as it hath a far more pleasing sound. This line seems to imply that what Shakespeare loves about hearing his mistress speak is what she has got to say and the quality of her ideas, rather than simply the sound of her voice. In line 11, he admits that he has never seen a goddess go, which means move or travel in archaic English, i.e., English that is no longer used in the same way. And he follows that admission with a colon, that double dots punctuation mark, implying that he's going to add further information or explain further. The explanation in line 12 is that when his mistress walks, she definitely treads on the ground. She is nothing like a goddess floating or gliding gently over the surface of the earth, as in the picture on the right. Notice how Shakespeare uses words with hard D and G sounds in them. Goddess, go, treads, and ground. Those are mimetic, onomatopoeic, because they mimic or copy the hard pounding rhythm of Shakespeare's mistress's feet hitting the ground. In this way, Shakespeare's mistress does not walk in the way that aristocratic women were expected to walk at all. She walks very much as a normal human being. And in fact, Elizabethan women were trained to walk very slowly, very gracefully, and with very tiny steps. They were trained to look as though they were gliding along. And dances were choreographed and their clothes were designed in such a way that they were actually forced to walk in this way. So you can see that perhaps he admires her because she breaks with convention, just as he is breaking with convention in his writing of the sonnet. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. In this final couplet, lines 13 to 14, Shakespeare swears by heaven in line 13 that his love, referring to both the woman that he loves and his act of loving her, is as rare, meaning special or unusual, as any of the non-existent idealized women that were commonly described in Elizabethan literature. Shakespeare says that if his mistress is compared to these non-existent women, then she is belied with, misrepresented, or lied about in false comparisons, false compare. Notice that he ironically swears on his love by heaven, which is the ultimate symbol of the ideal, after saying that he's never seen any goddesses, and so perhaps he doesn't believe in the ideal. Anyhow, in these lines he swears that he loves his mistress to the same extremes as the false comparisons that she and other women at his time had regularly been subjected to. His tone at the end juxtaposes his great love and admiration of his mistress, when he says that his love is rare, with his ridicule of the language of courtly love, by which he says has belied her by subjecting her and real Elizabethan women to the pain of false comparisons. The word belied has connotations of insult and injury as well. Remember that juxtaposition means putting two things close together for the purposes of highlighting how different they are. And that contrast highlights both how unusual Shakespeare's love was and how unusual his mistress was. And I think he's paying her the ultimate compliment. He knows that she doesn't measure up to the Elizabethan beauty standards in any way, but he loves her as much as those idealized women who supposedly measured up to the Elizabethan beauty standards were supposedly loved and to be admired, which was quite tricky because Shakespeare's implying that they didn't even exist. In fact, he implies that he loves her precisely because she's real, and he admires her mind rather than simply being focused on superficial surface appearances. So if you did think he was nasty and was writing her an insulting love sonnet, perhaps you should reconsider. And I think her response would have been something like that cartoon on the bottom right-hand corner. She knew that he was writing satirically and he was mocking sonnets, and he was being quite cheeky, which is why she says, "Thou art a scurvy knave." Question for discussion. Critically discuss the ways in which Shakespeare subverts Elizabethan beauty standards. Substantiate your response with detailed references to his use of structure, imagery, and tone. Before you start answering a question, make sure that you understand all of the technical language used. Critically discuss means to discuss in detail and think about the question from a variety of perspectives. Subverts means to undermine or turn upside down, metaphorically turn upside down. Elizabethan beauty standards were the norms or rules that outlined what was supposedly beautiful in England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. and substantiate means give evidence for your ideas from the poem. Structure is the way that the poem is built or constructed. Imagery is the poet's use of language techniques like similes, metaphors, personification, or sensory imagery. And remember, the tone is the emotions that an author or speaker conveys with their words. It is related to mood, but it's not exactly the same thing. Mood is the way that a reader or audience is made to feel, and unlike with tone, no speaker is necessary. I'm only going to give you some suggestions of things that you could comment on if you were asked to write this poetry essay in the exams. And I will talk you through the process of structuring a poetry essay as I discuss a possible answer. An introduction to a literature essay should always include your hypothesis, which is the big idea that you are setting out to prove. So start your hypothesis with the name of the text and the author, and then rephrase the question as a statement. And in this way, you will hopefully stick to the question throughout your essay, because this statement is what you are trying to prove throughout. You must also include a sentence where you explain how you will structure your essay. And notice that your introduction is very short. It's only 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So this is my introduction. Sonnet 130, or My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, you can call it either, which is the sonnet's alternative name, by William Shakespeare, can be read as satirizing and subverting Elizabethan beauty standards. This can be seen in Shakespeare's structure and his use of imagery and tone in the sonnet. Notice that in my overview statement, I said that I would discuss structure, imagery, and tone. Therefore, the body of my essay should consist of 3 paragraphs. In each paragraph, I need to specifically discuss structure or imagery or tone, and then link it to how Shakespeare subverts Elizabethan beauty standards. Each paragraph should also contain at least one argument that is linked to the topic. And remember that an argument always consists of a point you want to prove, evidence from the poem that proves that point, and an explanation of how the evidence proves the point. To remember the structure of an argument, remember the acronym PEE, where P is for point, E is for evidence, and the second E is for explanation. And you can add an L for a linking sentence to the next paragraph. Listen out for my PEEL or peel structure as I suggest what each paragraph could consist of. So in the sonnet, Shakespeare, this is my first paragraph. In the sonnet, Shakespeare uses a different structure to the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. A Petrarchan or Italian sonnet would usually consist of an octave and a sestet, but Shakespeare uses 3 quatrains and a final rhyming couplet. Each couplet focuses on subverting or undermining a different Elizabethan beauty standard. In the first quatrain, Shakespeare explains how his mistress does not look like the ideal Elizabethan woman. The second quatrain highlights how she does not smell like the ideal, and the third quatrain explains how she does not sound or move like the ideal. At first, the reader has the impression that Shakespeare is mocking his mistress, but the final couplet makes the focus of his satire clear when he says that he loves her as much as any she belied with false compare. Here he attacks the lies and false comparisons that were traditionally used in sonnets and the language of courtly love. My second paragraph must focus on Shakespeare's use of imagery and should ideally start with a linking sentence. Listen out for the link and the point evidence explanation argument in this paragraph. Shakespeare's imagery obviously satirizes both Elizabethan beauty standards and the language of courtly love traditionally used to describe them. This is seen in the first quatrain, where Shakespeare points out that his mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, highlighting the hyperbolic, exaggerated nature of this conceit that was common in courtly love poetry. He continues to point out that if snow is white, then in comparison his mistress's breasts are dun, a shade of brown usually referred to in descriptions of animals such as mice and horses. And again he highlights the gap between the idea and what is physically possible. This continues in the second stanza, where he says that she doesn't have roses in her cheeks, a comparison that seems ridiculous when considered literally, and that she does not breathe perfume as her breath reeks. Although reeks had less negative connotations in the Elizabethan era than it does today, the stanza still highlights the fact that Shakespeare loves a real woman and not a ridiculous figment of anyone's poetic imagination. Shakespeare strengthens this idea in the third quatrain when he states categorically that his mistress treads on the ground, and that although he has never seen a goddess go, the implication is that his mistress is a very ordinary woman who simply treads or walks along the ground in order to move around, and that she's not even remotely heavenly. In this way, Shakespeare's use of imagery subverts the Elizabethan beauty standards throughout the first 12 lines of the poem, and it also highlights how exaggerated and hyperbolic the descriptions of the Elizabethan beauty standards were in the traditional poetic conceits. I would now add my third paragraph, which should focus on tone. Again, I should start with a linking sentence. Listen out for it. Shakespeare's use of tone is closely aligned with his satirical parodies of traditional conceits and his ultimate admiration of the authentic nature of his mistress. His tone throughout the first 12 lines is satirical when referring to the Elizabethan beauty standards, and this is highlighted by the way that he makes these standards seem utterly ridiculous and impossible. For example, he uses a series of negative comparisons where he says that his mistress is not like, where he says what his mistress is not like. Her eyes are nothing like the sun. She has dun rather than snow white skin, and her hair is coarse and black, with black wires that grow on her head. He acknowledges that there are more aesthetically pleasing aspects to life than his mistress, when he says, I love to hear my mistress speak, but music hath a far more pleasing sound. But he highlights that the women who actually measure up to the highest of aesthetic standards don't even exist. This is implied when he says that he will acknowledge that he never saw a goddess go, but he knows for a fact that his mistress would not measure up even if he could compare her to a goddess that he had seen, because when his mistress walks, she treads on the ground. Shakespeare's dismissive tone with regards to Elizabethan beauty standards is most obvious in the final rhyming couplet, where he ironically swears by heaven, which is the ultimate symbol of the ideal, that he loves his mistress to the same extremes as the false comparisons that she and other women at his time had regularly been subjected to. His tone at the end juxtaposes his great love and admiration of his mistress in line 13 with his ridicule of the language of courtly love in line 14, which he says has belied her by subjecting her and real Elizabethan women to the pain of false comparisons. Remember that your conclusion is a short summary of why your hypothesis is correct. My conclusion would be the following. Based on the poet's use of an English or Shakespearean sonnet structure, where his use of imagery and tone in the first 12 lines seems to mock his mistress, and the fact that she definitely does not measure up to Elizabethan beauty standards of the time, the fact that this is followed by a volta and a dramatic shift in tone in the final rhyming couplet, where his love and admiration of his mistress is clearly expressed, and his contempt for the unrealistic beauty standards of the time is emphasized, means that he is subverting those beauty standards. So a few notes. This essay doesn't ask if you agree with the statement. It is a given in the topic that Shakespeare definitely subverts Elizabethan beauty standards. And because of the way that the question was phrased, arguing that he does subvert Elizabethan beauty standards, you cannot argue that he doesn't, because then you are actually contradicting the question. You also do not have to answer the question in exactly the same way that I did, and you would still get 100% with different arguments and evidence, as long as you're drawing all of it from the text. And notice that you can use this structure to write any literary essay or any other discursive essay, for example, a history essay. And I will create a specific video on discursive essay writing. but this was just to give you a quick and hopefully helpful formula that you can use for poetry essays. The vocabulary on the slides that follows is listed in the order in which it was used. Check that you've understood each word, make sure that you can spell each word correctly, and enjoy using this vocabulary when you're talking about this poem. So general vocabulary, beauty standards, courtly love, and poetic conceits. Vocabulary about structure, sonnet, syllable and syllable break, iambic pentameter, rhythm and rhyme structure, quatrain and rhyming couplet, enjambment, punctuation including colons, diction including archaic language, and the moods of the verb, which are subjunctive, where you're suggesting a wish or a possibility, imperative, where you're giving a command, indicative, where you are making a statement, and interrogative, where you are asking a question. For vocabulary used throughout this presentation. These are figures of speech. Please make sure that you don't mix them up with parts of speech. Parts of speech are nouns, adjectives, verbs, etc. They are not figures of speech, and you generally won't be asked about parts of speech in a literature paper. So the figures of speech I discussed were satire and subversion, exaggeration and hyperbole, parody, cliché, negative comparisons, mimesis, juxtaposition, sensory imagery, and I mentioned visual imagery, oral or sound imagery, that's spelled AU, and olfactory imagery, which is imagery that involves smell. Mood and tone, irony, metaphors, similes, extended metaphors and personification, and connotations and imagery. Phonic devices are language techniques that affect the way that a poem sounds when it is read out loud. And the 5 phonic devices that you must pay particular attention to are rhyme. Remember to spell it rhyme has you and me. Rhythm. Remember to spell it rhythm has your 2 hips moving. Alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I have created this channel so that any learner or teacher who is working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed teaching and learning materials. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe and pass the link on to any of your friends who would find this useful. You're also welcome to make a small donation to support this work, but definitely not expected to. If you do want to make a donation, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Thank you and good night.